During this session, we will hear from Taoyuan Wei, Arndt Filbacher, Wajiha Said, and Iman Hakiki. And just wonder, is Dr. Wei is online now?
Not yet. So we'll go ahead with Arndt and we'll keep an eye on Dr. Wei and introduce him second if he's here.
Yeah, sounds good. So now please allow me to introduce our first speaker, Arndt Filbacher from University of Hohenheim, presenting his study. So the floor is yours, Arndt.
Sorry, Arndt, you are on mute.
That was a good start. So thanks a lot for the kind introduction, Professor Chen, and I'm sorry, as just said, I have quite a difficult surname to pronounce in German. So my name is Arndt Feuerbacher, and this is joint work together with Anton Orloff from the Cicero Institute at Norway. And the talk is titled, Climate Change and Heat Stress Impacts, Does Seasonality of Labor Matter? And let me see if that works. As we all know, most of the research on climate change impacts has focused on crop changes in crop yields. And Tom Hurtle last year said very nicely that because of the data limitations, researchers looked for the car keys under the streetlights. That means they only looked at those impacts they could study well. But the more recent studies showed the high relevance of heat stress impacts for the agriculture sector. Studies like from Cicero Lima in Environmental Research Letters, and also from Anton Orloff in Global Environment Change. The heat stress impacts are especially important for low-income countries, as we all know, because they are characterized by high employment shares in agriculture, and also there we cannot expect a high scope for mitigation. We have, for instance, tractor cabins in more developed countries, but due to the often very small land holdings in low-income countries, that is also, for instance, one technology that is not as promising in those low-income countries. I just recently searched Scopus, and I didn't find a lot of economy-wide studies assessing heat stress impacts. I found around 10, for instance, by Rob DeLink, who studied inter alia heat stress impacts, and we mentioned the study by Orloff or Lima. And I think it's fair to say that either all or most of those studies look at the heat stress impacts as annual average shocks on labor productivity on a national labor market. Yet we know that heat stress shocks will not be constant within a country because of different climatic conditions within a country. So they will differ depending on where you are in the country. And also we already know, we should know that, well, heat stress is not constant across the year, but it's seasonal. So the contribution of this talk will focus on those 2 points. Not so much on the first one, where we look into geographic segmentation of the rural labor market, which is not such a novel thing. We segment the labor market into different agroecological zones. But I think the larger novelty is that we incorporate seasonal labor markets and see to what extent does this matter for the outcome of the impact. And the case study is a very small country in South Asia, Bhutan. You might have heard of it. It's the size of Switzerland in terms of land area, and the population is around 800,000. It's quite a low population density. Switzerland has 8 million people, if you want to compare. It's an agrarian economy, and we have a social accounting matrix for the year 2012 for Bhutan, which has a high disaggregation of the agriculture sector. Agriculture labor makes up 50% of total employment in the country. And in terms of household income, agriculture labor makes up 26% of agriculture households income. And it only makes up 7% of total factor income. So that already shows you that the non-agriculture economy in terms of factor income is quite important, even though that 7%, of course, does not include land or agriculture capital. we divide the country into 3 agroecological zones. First off, the subtropical humid agroclimate zone or agroecological zone is AZ1. It's all land below 1,200 meters. It makes up 33% of land. And it's on this map denoted by red or orange color, mostly in southern Bhutan, but you see also valleys reaching the northern part of the country. Then we have a subtropical dry agroecological zone, AZ2, makes up 36% of the country. That orange and yellow part, mostly, let's say, central Bhutan. And last but not least, the temperate climate or up to alpine climate above 1,800 meters of altitude, which makes up 30% of land. So roughly it's a third, a third, a third. That's quite convenient. Why Bhutan? Because here we have a unique database. We have extended this 2012 SAM to incorporate seasonality of rural labor, so that we can model seasonal labor markets by subdividing the annual labor count into monthly accounts. And also we incorporate seasonal leisure. And that is all already documented in a study from last year that was published in Food Policy, as you can see here. One of the key results here in terms of the data is that we know for each agroecological zone in what month, here shown by category of activities, what are farmers busy with. So we of course know that cropping is mostly done during the growing, weeding, harvesting season, and not so much in the winter, or if at all. And that non-farm activities like forestry or textile weaving is mostly done in the winter months. The same holds for leisure, for instance, which farmers mostly enjoy leisure during the off-season. That shouldn't come as a surprise. Just to mention that as well, the underlying data, I was able to rely on quite some secondary data, but I also conducted my own crop calendars with farmers, which was very insightful in different agroecological zones. So that was part of the data building exercise. And also when calibrating the quantity of seasonal leisure, which is difficult to measure empirically, and to also calibrate the total time endowment, which is not necessarily 365 days, as also, for instance, shown by Rutherford in a study that, because if you take too high of a time endowment, you end up with unrealistic wage and income elasticities of labor supply. So we used existing estimates for this to calibrate the time endowment. What do we get? First off, what is the point of departure is the annual model, where households' time endowment is one pool of labor units for the whole year, and it's a homogeneous labor unit, which is then demanded by economic or leisure activities. In the seasonal model, the step forward is to say, well, time supplied in January cannot be substituted with time supplied in December, right? So we split that time in those months. And the supply of January labor has to meet the demand of January labor. All right, how does this look like in the model, in the production system? Here you see the let's say, starting point, the default option under an annual model. Well, default option, every production structure looks slightly different. This is for our stage model, which I will explain in the following. There, farm labor is a substitute for capital, and the capital labor CS nest. And if we then go to the seasonal model, we introduce a further nest, quite simple, to account for the fact that an activity demands different labor from different months. And that again is a CES nest, where we know that the substitution is governed by a constant elasticity of substitution, or sigma, which is the degree of intertemporal substitution, and which governs the rigidity of seasonal labor, which depends on the nature of the activity, as I will show on the next slide. First of all, we don't really know that sigma for different activities. We had some sensible assumptions, but I think it's quite plausible to assume a rigid and a low sigma for cropping activities, a little bit higher sigma for livestock activities, and a high sigma up to 1.5 which is an ad hoc parameterization, admittedly, for non-farm activities such as forestry or textile weaving, which are flexible when you do them with some restrictions. For instance, by law in Bhutan, people cannot cut forests in any month, but they're quite flexible. The model that is now used in the following is a Cge model, which is a single country model based on stage, a static applied general equilibrium model. It's a comparative static model, and it's based on the 2012 SAM, as mentioned. We use that model for two setups, the annual and the seasonal model setup. There, the only difference, the disaggregation of labor in terms of the data, and also how that additional nest I've just shown is the only difference. The model closure for the analysis is that we use a flexible exchange rate, a fixed external balance, investment-driven closure, fixed external balance, and fixed government expenditure volume. All factors are fixed except for land. Here we use a land supply curve, and factors are mobile across activities within their segments, but they do not change their segments. So skilled labor stays skilled labor, and unskilled stays unskilled. What's the scenario? Now we talk about heat stress finally. We use a scenario that is based on the shared socioeconomic pathway middle of the road, SSP2, and on the representative concentration pathway that is based on radiative forcing of 6 watts per square meter by 2,100. We estimate the heat stress impact on worker productivity using the wet bulb globe temperature method, using here the ISO metric, similar to as Cicero did in his study in 2021. And for agriculture, we assume a work intensity of 400 watts, which we all know agriculture is hard work, especially in labor-intensive systems. We use slightly lower impacts for indoor activities as they are done under shade. But Bhutan being a monsoon economy, we need to keep in mind that with the monsoon comes a lot of humidity and moist stress. And so I think that maybe the difference is maybe not as high as maybe in other places. How does a shock look like? I'm showing here the shock in the year 2050 for different months, for different agroecological zones, for outdoor activities. And we see that in Bhutan, which is a very mountainous country, as I've shown, the shocks are very pronounced in the lowest altitude, which is the AZ1, the subtropical humid zone. There we really see high impacts, up to 14% reduction in labor capacity or labor productivity in the month of August. For the other two zones, it's much less, if not even zero, in the last zone, which is the temperate and alpine zone. So that there's a strong seasonal pattern. I think it's very clear. And this scenario is now run in two different models. Once where we just use the annual average shock for each zone. For AZ1, that would be 4.4% reduction in productivity. And then with the seasonal model, where productivity decreases specifically each month as shown on this graph. What is important, we don't assume any other impacts. Yields stay constant. The world market prices stay constant, so there's no shock on the rest of the world, which has certain implications for our interpretation of the results. Let me now turn to the results. Here we see changes in wage rates for the three different agroecological zones. First of all, let me start with the two bottom ones. Not a lot is happening there. Why? Because the shocks are so low for those two zones. But the real music is playing in the first zone, where we have high spikes in wage rates on July and August, which, no surprise, which is when we expect the highest heat impact. On average, the wage rate change in the seasonal model is just slightly higher than in the annual model. The annual model is 0.7. In the seasonal model, on average, is 0.9. But we need to bear in mind that activities have different profiles of what labor they demanded in what month. So rice, for instance, needs a lot of labor in July and August, and forestry doesn't. So we see a very, very different impact on the output front. Here you see output for three different agroecological zones. And you see that most of the results is happening in the first agroecological zone, where cereals are decreasing a lot, much more in the seasonal model than in the annual model. And in the other two zones, not so much is happening. Actually, in the ASAT3, probably we see an increase in maize to compensate for the reduction in maize in ASAT1. Okay, how does this look at the aggregate level? When we look at purchaser prices, we see much stronger purchaser price increases in the annual model for food and crops. And surprisingly, maybe you think forest prices decrease in the seasonal model, but they increase in the annual model. Why is this? Because in the seasonal model, forestry needs off-season work, and in the off-season, in the winter time, there is no heat stress impact. So that that activity is actually benefiting from relative price changes. On the single forest leisure, it's also interesting that in the annual model, the leisure price increases much more in the annual setup compared to the seasonal setup. Why? Because in the seasonal model, leisure is mostly enjoyed, as I mentioned before, in the off-season month, and that's when there is no heat stress impact, or very little heat stress impact. The differences in results are much more pronounced when we look at the single commodities. Here, rice and maize. Cereals are mostly impacted by this shock. Turning to the macro level and leaving, let's say, the focus on the agriculture sector, the differences between both model setups are at first sight not as strong. But if we look at, for instance, consumption changes, yes, the decline in consumption is much stronger for the seasonal model and driven by a much higher decline in the consumption of agriculture households. Overall, the shocks are quite modest because of the strong dependent or the strong profile of the altitudes, let's say, in the low altitude. That's only where we actually have these heat stress impacts, not so much in the other two. So we should take this into account. And again, on this slide, on the aggregate, we also see the strong differences in the results. If we look at food purchaser prices or food production, is declining, of course, and it's almost twice as high, the rate of decline in the seasonal model. And also the decline in arable land supply is much more in the seasonal model. So farmers do not manage to cultivate as much land in the seasonal model compared to the annual model because of these additional constraints and of this high shocks in those crucial months. Here, last results slide, I show the welfare effects, including changes in leisure. For all households, the decline in welfare is higher for the seasonal model than the annual model. Turning to the agriculture household types, what is interesting is that for landless households, they actually have a lower welfare decline because wage rates increase at a higher rate under the seasonal model. So they actually benefit a little bit more because they have higher labor income. But overall, land rents decline much more in the seasonal model, so farm households have stronger welfare declines. And now I'm adding a second y-axis to show the absolute percentage difference between the seasonal and the annual model, just to highlight that the difference in welfare effects is in percentage terms, not in percentage points, but in percentage difference, is about almost 18% if you only look at the agriculture households, and about 16% if we look at all households. And it's a difficulty I often face. When are we really concerned about that another model leads to different results because we don't have any p-value or something like that, right? So we struggle with when is something substantial, and I think this is substantial enough. Yes, I think I'll come to the conclusions because I think that was the reminder for 2 minutes. So I think the results are preliminary, but we can see we get different results when we include seasonality. We understate the impacts on the agriculture sector and on agriculture household welfare, as just mentioned. the relevance of seasonality is, I think, unquestionable for high labor-intensive agriculture sectors in those low-income countries. So a little bit provocative. Maybe we still look for the keys under the streetlights if we leave that out. But in addition, I think that we are at the risk of underestimating the economic cost of heat stress. But I understand that if we estimate the impact of heat stress on a global level, the data challenge is too high to include seasonality of labor. But I think for a single country analysis, that can be done. This is the last slide. We know that our results are preliminary. We need to do better robustness checks and sensitivity analysis across different global circulation models and RCPs and assessment metrics. Oopsie. And also, while seasonality is a blind spot, I acknowledge that Bhutan is not the best case study to use, but we just happen to have the data for it. India, Bangladesh, other monsoon countries would give a much better case study, and I'm happy to work with it if someone can give me the data. And yes, maybe there's a shortcut in future research by using the annual model, but modifying the shock such that the seasonality is accounted for instance, by adjusting the shock by growing season. Anton Olof did something like this in a study of his. You can share details. I'm not still super convinced by it, but I need to see. So I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thanks. It's a great presentation, and if anyone has questions, you may enter that in the chat board. And now we already have one question from Tom Hertel. So the question is about the seasonality dimension. So
I can say it.
Sure.
Here, Henry. Anyway, congrats on the seasonality aspect. That's very interesting. I was wondering about the labor markets. I mean, I can see why AEZ might be a relevant concept for land market clearing, but labor markets, maybe they move this way. I mean, you've got us, the AEZ's laid out that way in the map, but the people might move this way. Why don't they move from AZ1 to AZ2 or vice versa? They need more people in AZ1. Have you thought about structuring the labor markets in a different way? And then just another little question, I didn't quite get what was the time frame, what is the global warming? Is it 2 degrees, 3 degrees, whatever?
Yeah, thank you very much, Tom. First, on the labor market disaggregation segmentation, yes, there could be other approaches. I've thought about other approaches, but given that we have this low altitude plain in the south, and in altitude being a barrier for people to move, and you know, when you have agriculture, it's mostly in a valley or it's up in the mountain in some scattered regions anyway, so people don't move a lot. That's the first thing. People don't move a lot in agriculture across zones anyhow. But we could model seasonal migration across zones, and probably in a more nuanced model, we should account for the fact that eastern Bhutan is much less developed than western Bhutan, so one could add that dimension to it. But I think this was, let's say, I didn't even chose that disaggregation for this paper, because it kind of suited this application. It made sense before then, because this is how people understand the agriculture sector in the country itself, say, okay, we have different zones with different yields, with different crops, with this limited mobility. So it was just a natural choice. And the second, the time frame. So it's the RCP 6.0 radiative forcing. Now you hit, I don't know on the tip of my tongue whether this is a 3% centigrade increase. I should have said that, I should have known, but I don't know. But Anton maybe can...
it's around 3 degrees by the end of the century, yeah. But it depends also on the climate model. I think you use GFDL, yeah? It's a cool model. If you go for HGM or UK ECM, the climate sensitivity is like double, then you have a higher warming. So it's actually quite optimistic scenario with GFDL.
Okay, great. Thank you for helping. Yeah. I hope that answered your questions. And finally, do households experience this utility from outdoor work under his... I didn't answer that question. You still want that question answered, Tom? Well, this utility, we don't... Well, they get... I need to think about that. I haven't thought about that aspect. But because their labor now supplies less factor services and they get less from their work, I guess there is a disutility, but not in terms of, it doesn't enter the consumption sphere, right? That is not the case.
There are health effects from heat stress, and I could see people saying, gee, I don't want to work in agriculture anymore. And that would be another element in your utility function, another element in welfare, another element in labor supply.
Very interesting thought. Thanks for that. Yeah, I need. There's no consideration of that, but it's a nice thought. Thank you.
Any other questions? So if not, then I can provide one. So, Ant, I just wonder, in your research, do you consider technological improvement in developing countries? For example, in the future, there could be more air-conditioned tractors in developing countries to reduce the impact of heat stress on productivity. Is there something also considered in your study?
Not in this study. I mean, we kept it super simple just to show how the results differed using the annual and the seasonal model. And if we are thinking of doing a more empirically sound study, let's say, where we don't focus on this methodological difference, where we would then look at maybe also including the yield impacts, including, as we said, mitigation options, technologies. But we have to keep in mind agriculture in Bhutan and in similar countries is still, in terms of technology, still very simple, I would say, and very labor intensive. So, and so as mentioned in the beginning, tractor cabins which are climatized, I don't see that coming on in a country where the average farm household's land holding is 1 hectare, right? And also the plot sizes are very small, so they work with power tillers mostly, if they are mechanized. Of course, if we go to 2050, 2100, maybe by then robots will do the job for us, right? I was thinking about that, but so that would be a second study where the technology roles would matter much more, and Anton actually knows much more about this. Anton, if you want to add something.
Yeah, that's a good point, because you assume 400 watts, which is basically like manual work, and by middle of the century there will be some mechanization. Of course, it depends on the scenario. If you assume like SSP1 sustainability, that they might apply some rapid mechanization, more tractors, more air conditioning. We did some work on implementing air conditioning and mechanization using the FAO-stat data. They provide tractors per hectare. We did some regression analysis just to extrapolate the results. Indeed, but also shifting working hours could be an option. I mean, there are several adaptation measures, and in your Cge, I think you do have some adaptation like mechanization via substitution, labor for capital. It is a part of optimization problem, but it could be also modeled in autonomous way, like path dependent, when you calibrate your baseline and implementing the mechanization there in the baseline level. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. And any other questions? So feel free to provide your thoughts, and you may enter the questions on the chat board so everyone can see it. You may also ask your questions directly by unmute yourself.
I noticed Tao Yang is here, so I think he'll be the next speaker. Is that right?
Yes, sorry. Just now, for half an hour, the power is off in my whole office.
Hi, Taoyuan. Good to
Hi.
see you. Yep.
Yeah. You hear me? Yeah, I think.
Dr. Wei, I'm the host of this session. Do you want to go ahead and see if you can share screen?
Yes, I can do that. Yeah. Screen should be this one. It works. Yeah.
Yes, works great.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm sorry to be late, but the problem solved very quickly. So thanks them. Yeah. Okay. I'm happy to be here to present my study in this session. Yeah. The study is related to climate damage, how to estimate economic damage of climate change from physical damage. We all know climate change will lead to some damage to some sectors like agriculture. It may reduce crop yields, and there are some physical models, crop growth model. They can estimate the physical damage in tons to the crop yields. But how to estimate the economic damage? Yes, typically, to estimate economic damage, we introduce a price. Then we multiply the price with the physical damage to get the economic damage. Yeah. In the case of losses of crop yields, we use the crop price, of course. And then in the estimates, the price is typically assumed constant. So it seems in these estimates, the climate change wouldn't influence the market and wouldn't change the crop price. But this might not be true, particularly for agriculture. And if we consider the climate change impacts happens in a local level, it may change the price dramatically. There are several reasons that are listed here. First, the agriculture producers or farmers may adjust their inputs if they were warned earlier. For example, the weather forecast may indicate a dry period, and then farmers can try to adjust their inputs to use more at-ground water to reduce the potential damage. And also, of course, the adaptation options is limited. Yes, and it might be impossible for farmers, for example, to move the whole land to a good place with very nice weather and very good productivity, but it's impossible. Yes. Yeah. Then we have to consider in the economics how to consider the price change effects. This is a simple theoretical illustration in these slides. We try to introduce a production function for agriculture and also for other activities. For agriculture, for agriculture, the production is related to all the primary factors. Here it's represented by the capital K, Kg. And also the agricultural production also affected, related to land, available land, and that's represented by R bar. And again, climate change represented by capital T is very important for agriculture in this study. And for the other productions, we assume here is only related to primary factors. There are no climate change impacts. And then having this in mind, then we try to model the climate change impacts in the second row. We introduce some more or less more specific production function. That means we have two ways to do this. One, we just assume climate change will affect the total factor productivity. It happens here. And then for the other part, it's still the same. It means even we have the same inputs, we get less output proportionally. The other way to do this, we just assume, okay, the climate change will only affect the land productivity. It wouldn't change other things. It appears like here, a parameter will change, a parameter before the land it represents the land productivity. That's the two ways to do this. And yeah, besides this, we also need to consider the whole market. Then we have to consider the utility function of consumers, and both sides will determine the price. In this way, we can try to calculate the price change and calculate the price change effects when we estimate economic damage. So our purpose here is just to say how to what extent the price change effects will be. We use a static model here, the static Cge model. This model is based on GTAP database version 9 with the base year 2011. Yeah, we just use this static. The model is calibrated around the GTAP data years 2011. And in the reference, we don't introduce any climate change. But for other 4 scenarios here, output, land city, and land RF, we consider the same physical impacts on green yields. Here, green, we consider 3 main greens. That's wheat, rice, and maize. Yeah. We assume the physical impact is the same, but it's introduced in different places in the model. In the output scenario, we introduce the climate change impacts to the total factor productivity, TFP. And for the other 3, we introduce the land productivity. But for the land productivity 3 cases, we take 3 alternatives of consumer functions. The default one is sales function, and then we in the other scenarios we consider capital loss utility function and also Leontief utility function. Based on this, we try to calculate the damage on global GDP. That represents the economic damage. Yes, in this figure, you can see here it shows the damage for 2050, also 2100. But let us focus on the cases of 2100 at the moment. So the red bars here, like here, is just GDP calculated at the current price. It's more or less, you can ask that the constant price, because this is a static model. And yeah, we assume no price change when we calculate this one. For the blue one, we calculate GDP at global CPI, global consumer price index. In this case, I think is more or less mimic the PPP price, the PPP GDP, that's purchasing power poverty measures. And the green one, we calculate GDP at national CPI. We just observe here is the first, you can say that assumptions matter a lot in some cases, especially for the output case. The calculated economic damage or GDP losses is much larger than these other 3 cases. This implies, this implies a very dramatic price change effects if at certain assumptions. And the second point here is in the 3 land productive scenarios, the last 3, and the case of CES and the capital loss function are similar, but the Leontief function lead to very much smaller price change effects. This also indicates that the utility function forms also play the role in the estimation of economic damage. And the third one you can see here, yeah, for all the calculated economic damage or GDP losses, the current price, the red one, is always much smaller than the other two. GDP calculated at global CPI and the national CPI. Yeah. So this also tell us, indicate the price change effects couldn't be overlooked. Yes. Also, perhaps you already noticed the GDP calculated at the global CPI and the national CPI at the global level. Yeah, it's the same, exactly the same. But at the regional level, they are quite different. These two figures compare these two at the regional level. The left one is GDP calculated at global CPI. The right one at the national CPI. Yeah, compared to the GDP losses at the global CPI, the GDP losses at the national CPI are much smaller for certain developed countries like US and Canada, but much larger than in some developing countries, particularly in Africa and South Asia. So if we trust the national CPI is a better price indicator, then we should use the GDP at national CPI to indicate the economic damage in these countries. Yes, that's the main context and a brief conclusion. Yeah, changes in relative price may modify the estimated economic damage considerably. We couldn't ignore it. And then if our aim is to compare economic damage or economic welfare across regions, then we should use GDP at regional or local CPI rather than PPP. And in some, yeah, just mention it, in some integrated assessment models, they don't specify the utility function, and the GDP is interpreted as an indicator of welfare, then I would recommend to use national CPI deflated GDP to estimate economic damage. Yeah, thank you. That's all from me. So I try to be short since I have wasted some time. Thank you. And any comments, questions?
Thank you, Taoyuan, for the great presentation. So any questions from the audience? So feel free to enter your question on the chat board so everyone can see it. If not, I can provide one question. So my question is that the considered negative impact is for 2050 or 2100 in your model, while the base year of your static CGE is for 2011. So the question is, do you forward calibrate the model to a future state like 2050 or 2100 to represent the economy in that time point?
No, not really, because you know, I try to calculate the very detailed regional level. That's 140 regions. Then that's really one reason why I choose static model. I didn't consider the future change in in economic scale and population, technology change. These are not considered. But for me, I think more or less, even if we consider all these changes, it has more or less the same, yeah, not exactly same, similar effects on the modeling, on all the scenarios. We face more or less the same problem. It means the the assumptions of the model will generate more or less very significant difference. It might be okay for some developing countries, the impacts might be smaller or larger, but yeah, the main conclusion, we shouldn't ignore the price change effects, should be still valid.
Thank you, Taoyuan.
Thank you.
So, any other questions? Feel free to provide your insights, comments, or questions in the chat board. And your feedback will be valuable not only to the presenter, but also to everyone. So for the sake of time, if there are no further questions, I think we can move to our next presentation. I think it will be by Iman Hakiki, presenting margins of adaptation to human heat stress. So Iman, you may try to upload to share your presentation, and then all will be yours.
Okay, let me see if I can share it from here. Okay, hello everybody. My name is Iman Haqiqi. I'm a postdoc at Purdue University. This is a collaborative work. The idea started after a discussion with Jonathan Buzan, Cicero, and Dr. Herzl, a follow-up of their publication. The focus of this study is going to be the margins of adaptation. So we know the heat stress is important, but we want to see the significance of each adaptation channel here. Okay, so why? Well, labor is important. So depending on economic activity and region, it can contribute to 20% to 70% of production costs. On the other hand, heat stress currently exists, and climate change is going to intensify that. So I think the impact on future production will be significant, and we need to consider that. So the approach we are taking is global to local analysis of system sustainability. So this is part of the GLASS team. So GLASS is now part of a broader network. It's called GLASSNet, so a network of networks from different teams around the world, focusing on challenges on food security and environmental sustainability. Each team may use different tools and focus on different dimensions of these challenges. But the important part is that we usually look at the global drivers and the impacts on local stresses or local sustainability, but we usually ignore the feedback from local to global. And what this framework suggests is that we have to consider not only the global to local linkages, but also local to global, different scales. And you will be surprised to see how big can be the impact of local shocks and policies on global changes. So I want to start with this. This is one of the papers mostly cited in the heat stress literature. In 1947 experiments, people usually just mention that, hey, they increased the temperature, you can see in the graph, and the work that was done was decreasing. I want to mention another part in the table. So they provided different levels of incentives, which can be very interesting for economists. So I'm going to invite you to look at the paper and the table and see if you can use that. So we know that heterostress is important, but mostly, as previous presentations mentioned, people were working on heterostress impact on crops, not labor. And the reason is that it was discussed with Dr. Herzl again. So the data exists for crops. So it's easier to do crop yield analysis than having labor analysis, because there are different aspects and dimensions to labor. One of the interesting studies also done with Cicero and Dr. Herzl and others, and you can see the impact of heterostress on labor using GTAP framework. So they aggregated the heterostress to GTAP regions, and you see they show that heterostress on labor is very, very important. So what this research is doing, first of all, we are providing a global gridded database on projected impact of heterostress by labor type and economic activity, which can be used, it can be linked to GTAP economic activities and different labor types, GTAP and any other economic database and model. Also, the goal is to quantify the significance of different adaptation channels at local, global, and national level. So I'm not going to talk a lot about this part. I'm focusing on the data analysis part. But in the future, in the paper comes out, you will see the significance on that. And some of the results you will see in next presentations by what you have. Data we are using are based on CMIP6 climate models, and the methods are very similar to what is published, but a little bit different. We'll talk about that. Data, GTAP data. Also, we use some information from Cge Model, which is a simplified model of prices, land use, and environment. So, we talked about here, what you see is direct impact. So look at this at a national food market. We have marginal cost of supply, and you want to produce Q star amount of food. Now, because labor capacity is lower, if you want to produce the same amount of food Q star, you have to hire more labor, and that will increase the cost. So that's the initial direct impact of shock on the food market. There are demand responses that can reduce the shock on prices, but that changes the quantity of food produced. There can be at the end the changes on supply to food sector, because other sectors are also affected. It can be impact on income and demand for food up or down. So these are the things that I'm not going to show in this presentation. I'm focusing on direct impacts only. So let's move forward. There are multiple ways to calculate heterostress metrics. Even the same metric. Some are more accurate than others. And we are trying to use the most accurate here. And heterostress, the reason is that heterostress is a nonlinear combination of temperature, humidity, radiation, and it is important to consider high frequency output and higher resolution information. If not, you will get some errors by more than 2 degrees Celsius, and that will get some bias in the estimation. So here, what you see is an example of the metric that we are using. This is potential change in labor capacity working indoor. during the day. So we excluded nighttime working, so it's only daytime working. And considering 5 degrees Celsius to be warming scenario. So we are not talking about a time in the future. We just look at this, assume that today in current economy, we have 5 degrees C warming. What will happen? So this is for indoor, and this is for outdoor. People who are working outdoor. I'm going back and forth. So for people who are working indoor, the maximum reduction in labor capacity is around 50%. But people who are working outdoor, in some places, they are losing the capacity to work around 75%. And this is for 400 watts, which is the strength. Usually they assign that to agriculture, but let's see, we will improve that a little bit. So to use that for an economic study, we know that the impact on people who are working potentially outdoor and indoor, and we know the impact on different work intensity. What we need is the share of labor working outdoor in each occupation, in each economic activity, and then the share of strength requirements. So how many of agriculture requires 200 watt, how much of it requires 400? So this is, not all the agriculture requires 400. So this is important. So we use database, a unique database from Bureau of Labor Statistics. So, and we assign the work intensity with strength requirements. So if the data says this occupation and this economic activity requires light strength, we assign that to 200. If it's medium, 300, heavy, 400, and very heavy, 600 watts. So this is the way we translate that data. And then the database also includes the share of labor who is working outdoor. This is important. So if you have a labor in one economic activity, which is working indoor under shade, the impacts will be different. I don't know if it's readable or not. So these are the 22 Bls occupations. We mapped that to GTAP labor categories. So we assign that with colors, white color, purple color, pink, and blue. So white colors are management and office works, purple are technicians and professionals, pink are service and shop workers, and blue colors are those unskilled workers, farm constructions, who usually work outside. Let's look at the direct impact. So the direct impact means without any adaptation, just considering GTAP cost shares and the database that we calculate here. We combine this with region-specific cost share of different labor categories and different economic activities. So what you see here is, okay, it's all green, right? It's good. It's the impact on agriculture price, production cost, only in 1 degree Celsius warming. So in 1 degree Celsius warming, you see almost no impact. If you go 2 degree, you see some places in West Africa on 5% increase in price. 3 degrees Celsius, you see around 10% increase in production cost in some part of Africa, and yeah, and then 4 degrees Celsius, you see up to 15%. And if you go to 5 degrees Celsius, you see in some parts of the world, the production costs will increase up to 20%. This is the direct cost of heat stress. And what this is important because we are trying to identify the hot spots for each sector and for each scenario. So for agriculture, you see West Africa is very important for part of India, Middle East, other tropical regions. Now going to construction, I'm going to show you only the 5 degrees Celsius warming scenario. And you see all of a sudden West Africa is not that affected. The reason is that the share of labor, so this is the value share of labor. In West Africa, for construction sector is smaller, but on the Amazon in South America it's a little bit higher. But so the point is that there is a different pattern for each sector. And for calculating this, we consider different labor type occupations, how much each of them is exposed to outdoor, and how much strength is required for doing that occupation. For manufacturing, a 5 degrees C is very little, and that's because most of the manufacturing are indoor, and still some parts of South America seeing some cost. For services is a bit higher than manufacturing, because some of the services are exposed to outdoor, and also they require higher strength compared to other regions, to other sectors. To compare these together, look at this map. You can see here in top left is agriculture, top right is construction. You can see definitely there is a different pattern around the world in only direct impact. And the implications is that, so if you have a gridded model, not a regional model aggregated to countries or more aggregated regions, you may see some movements within a region. So like within Brazil or within a country here, I don't know what's the country name here. But so that's important to see movement within a country. So there are some notes here. So, these are based on temporal means. That means they are based on daily data. If you want to look at one extreme event, probably there is also a difference. So if you have in 1 year a heat wave, that will be different. So these are means and averages. If you want to use that for aggregate models, like aggregate GTAP models, or you want to aggregate this to agroecological zones, AEZs, or anything else, you need some weights, like we use agricultural production for agricultural sectors and population weight pattern for non-agricultural sectors. Okay, to wrap up, here in this research, we identified the locations around the world that labor heat stress is important for different sectors. I showed you four major economic sectors, but we can assign that to other sectors too. Direct impact without any adaptation can increase production costs by up to 20%. For margins of adaptation, what we have in mind is the change in the location of production. So it includes change in pattern of cropland and migration. Another adaptation channel can be labor capital substitution mechanizations. Almost any model, Cge Model, has this labor capital substitution, and you can see that the significance of that substitution in the results. Another important part is international trade. As we see significant heterogeneity in these results, so we expect that international trade can serve a buffer to reduce the price changes. There are structural change, which it means people move from one sector to another sector. So you see in one country, some sectors will shrink, some other sectors will expand. These are another sources of adaptations. And finally, increase in employment. So you need more people to do the same job. And that means if you want any Cge model, probably we need to rethink about structure of labor market and labor supply, how we want to manage that. And that's it. Thank you very much. I'd like to invite you to look at the My Hub website and the GLASS web page. And if you have any question, this is my email. I'm going to stop here, and if you have any questions, listen.
Thank you very much, Iman, for the very interesting study. And now it's time for the audience to have questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to enter that in the chat board and share with everyone. So we already have one from Sarabrashi. So Sarabrashi, would you like to elaborate your question?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Iman, great talk. So like you said, the relatively smaller impact on manufacturing really stands out compared to the other sectors. But even indoor work can be impacted by heat stress. If it's humid, circumstances might be more. So like, does it assume, what do you think is underlying the lesser impact on manufacturing? You do say that this does not include adaptations. Does it assume universal air conditioning, or what is your intuition about that?
Oh, thank you. Great question. So I think what you see in construction and agriculture is that the share of labor is very high in agriculture, the share of labor which is working outdoor. In manufacturing, first of all, the share of labor is lower compared to agriculture in general. And then the share of labor which is working outdoor is also smaller. So there are two different aspects to this. The overall share of labor and then the share of labor which is working outdoor. But we can look into this more further if you like.
Oh, that makes sense. Thank you.
What about the air conditioning, Iman? Are you assuming air conditioning or not?
Excellent question. So here we don't consider air conditioning, and we thought about that. You will see in next presentation with your GTAP. So there are different adaptations, and the easiest thing that comes to mind, say, okay, we use air conditioning if you are working indoor. We had some ideas how to implement that, but for this work yet we have not considered that. But yes, if in the future people are using a better air conditioning, definitely the impact on indoor. Well, if you are under shade and you have air conditioning, then there is no reason that your productivity is lower except you are using social media.
Thank you. So we have another question from Gabriel. So Gabriel, would you like to elaborate your question?
Yes, I can read it. So thank you for the interesting presentation. So how do you think to use these impacts on labor in the context of the GTAP model? I guess through labor sectoral productivity, and then as a measure for adaptation, you want to include in the analysis also international migration. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Very good question. So the last slide, if you still see it, it's about simple G. And simple G is a partial equilibrium model. It's not general equilibrium model, but it includes 2 million grid cells, and it includes agriculture. So we have two research agendas here. So first is using simple G because it gives us a great high resolution information on the grid cell level adaptation. And for grid cell level adaptation, specifically for agriculture, it will be important. And then for GTAP, you can wait for the next presentation and you will see that Wajiha will present the results to you. So we have to aggregate these from grid cell level to GTAP regions. I think we have 136 or 7 regions for this next presentation. And yes, it will be the shock on labor in the model, and then you will see the well, for that, yet we don't have labor migration. Labor will be added later. Thank you. That's a great comment.
Thank you, Iman, and thank you, Gabriel. So any other questions? So Iman, I have one question for you. So I just wonder, in your study, you mentioned that you also consider adaptation at the local level. And my question is that at the local level, the resolution is higher than the resolution provided by the GTAP database. So how do you pursue resolution at the local level? Do you use some kind of downscaling procedure, or what kind of strategy to do that?
Thank you very much. That's a tough question. So for gridded modeling for simple G, we have some observational data at the grid cell level. So those are satellite scans. Some of them have been validated against some other census data or other observational data. So part of it is observation, and part of it is downscaling. Like the value, the share of labor, what I used there, I just assumed that the share of labor, for example, the share of unskilled labor in agriculture in Nigeria, for all the grid cells is the same share. So just one share for all the grid cells within the country. So I do not use any downscaling for that. But for other things like agriculture, when we talk about yield, we talk about, we have parameterization of simple G that we use a different high resolution information to parameterize elasticity of substitution, elasticity of transformation, supply elasticity, for example, for land, supply elasticity for water. So these are the information that we have some information, and we can do a little bit of empirical work there to estimate them or calibrate them. So it's a combination of calibration, estimation, and this is a work in progress, but we do validate the model against historical observation to see if the model can reproduce the pattern of changes, the change in pattern of, for example, land use and water use. For non-agricultural sector, it's difficult. For non-agricultural sector, we use the population map. So we enjoy, there are some estimates of gridded GDP and gridded populations. Those are also based on a lot of different assumptions, but that's the best thing that we have.
Thank you, Iman. Yes, yeah, I think I can imagine it's a tough project. So yeah, it's great to learn the strategies you are doing in connecting a low resolution regional scale to a high resolution one. So any other questions? So again, if you have questions or comments, you are very welcome to provide them in the chat board. So if there are no further questions, let's thank Iman again. And I think it's time for us to move ahead. And let me introduce our next presenter, Wajiha from the Center of Global Trade Analysis. She will be presenting heat stress, agriculture labor, and poverty impacts of climate change. So Wajiha, all is yours now. You may share your presentation and take your time to make sure everything's correct. So Wajiha, oh yes,
Yeah.
you're muted.
Thank you. Can you see my slides okay?
Yeah, I think it's sharing now. We should be able to see the content soon.
Okay.
Yes, it works.
Okay, perfect. So like the other presentations in this session, this paper is about heat stress and labor. But in this paper, we're going to be looking at the global sectoral as well as the poverty impacts of heat stress. My co-authors on this paper are Iman Hakiki and Tom Hurtle from GTAP, and also Chin Kong and Matt Huber from Purdue's Earth, Atmospheric and Planetary Sciences Department. So this is kind of late in this session, but here I'm going to begin with describing what we mean by heat stress in humans. We're basically describing conditions in which it isn't possible for the human body to cool itself enough. So the graphic on the right illustrates that there are many factors that determine this. So for example, so all the red things in that graphic are things that cause the body to heat up. So for example, metabolic production is the heat that is generated internally when we engage in physical activity. All the blue arrows there are mechanisms by which the body cools itself. So notice that evaporation is a really important one. As we sweat, as we become overheated, we sweat, and the evaporation of that sweat cools us down. So heat stress is then the outcome of manual labor, high temperatures, solar radiation, as well as humid conditions. And if you have high temperatures, high humid conditions, and manual labor, that pretty much describes occupations like farming and construction work in tropical regions. So if you're in a situation of high heat stress, what do you do? In order to avoid having heat exhaustion or heat stroke, you would have to slow down or stop and take a rest. So heat stress causes labor productivity losses, and there's a body of scientific literature that estimates this loss of productivity due to heat stress. I'm not going into details here, but broadly speaking, they fall into two categories. One uses physiological methods, and the other use empirical methods. So that's actual field experiments or observation of real people doing real work. What we're going to do is use one of those studies, one of the physiological ones, to estimate loss of productivity due to heat stress, and then assess the economic implications of this loss of productivity. And this sort of an assessment has been done before, but we're going to add some refinements. So first, we're going to account for heterogeneity of labor types. So within the same sector, as Iman described, you can have different types of labor, blue-collar workers, white-collar workers, etc. And all of them can be working at different work intensities and can have different frequency of exposure to the sun. The other refinement we're doing is we're doing a very disaggregated analysis. So we're looking at 65 sectors, 137 regions, and 4 labor types. And finally, we're also going to provide some assessment of how poverty is affected in a subset of regions. So this graphic basically shows the 4 steps that we follow in this study. The first 2 are concerned with actually estimating what heat stress is going to be like in the future. So we begin with inputs from 11 climate models, and we're using the mean of these for the moment. From these climate models, we obtain data on all the variables that are relevant for heat stress. So that's temperature, humidity, wind speed, air pressure, and radiative factors. The scenario we're considering is one where global mean temperatures increase by 3 degrees Celsius relative to our base period, which is the 60s through to the 80s. The resolution and frequency is high, and this is the same. It's the same stuff that Iman just presented. In step 2, we use these data to estimate what heat stress is going to be like. So as Iman mentioned, there are many types of heat stress metrics, and we have tried to use the best one. So it's the wet bulb globe temperature, and more specifically, it's approximated using this Lil-Jegren method, which is the more accurate measurement because it accounts for all of the variables mentioned there. It doesn't leave anything out. So once we have these heat stress projections for the future, the next step is to measure the labor capacity losses associated with that. For that, we use one of the physiological studies, as I mentioned, is cited here, Broad et al. 2018. So this is a labor response function, and it imposes a safety standard, the one referenced here. And it essentially says that people are going to work only up to the point where it is safe to do so. So this analysis can be thought of as the economic effects of heat stress if people were to avoid getting heat stroke and heat exhaustion or putting themselves at risk. So these labor capacity losses, we get them by grid cell. And as Iman described, here you also have to make some sort of assumption about what the work intensity is like and what the sun exposure is. Is this work being done indoors or outdoors? So we start by estimating these labor capacity losses for every grid cell for 4 different work intensities and for both outdoor and indoor exposure. We then aggregate over work intensities and sun exposure to get labor capacity losses by region, sector, and labor type. And this is using the BLS data. So this is the work that Iman just described. So this is repeating what Iman just described in greater detail. So what the BLS data tells us is that, for example, in the agricultural sector, you have different types of workers. So let's consider blue-collar workers. The BLS data will tell us what proportion of these workers work constantly outdoors or frequently or seldomly outdoors. And then for each of these, it will also tell us what type of work they're doing. Is it very heavy intensity work, or is it very light or sedentary work? So using proportions from this BLS data set, we're able to go from labor capacity losses that are by intensity and sun exposure to labor capacity losses that are by labor type and sector. And this final sort of formulation of labor capacity losses is the shock that we then introduce into GTAP to assess our economic impacts. We're using GTAP POV, which is the poverty extension of GTAP. The database is version 10. And then within the POV module, we also updated the poverty headcount data for the 27 countries that are included in the POV module. So here I'm just I've pulled out a couple of the equations from the CES nest that are most relevant. So, and these will help inform some of the results that we're going to see in just a bit. So the first equation is how labor demand is determined. Well, the demand for all endowments, but as an example, let's think of labor demand. As heat stress causes productivity of labor to fall, it's this AFE parameter that we're shocking. So as this changes, the demand for labor is going to change, and this change is going to be the sum of three different effects. There's an expansion effect, there's a substitution effect with capital, for example, and then there's the direct effect of the productivity effect itself. So the takeaway here is that the net effect on labor demand is ambiguous. It depends on which of these factors or which of these effects is going to be dominant in the end. The second equation is the price, or the zero profit condition that determines the expansion or contraction of the sector. So that's also relevant here. Okay, so finally turning to the actual results for numbers. So this is a summary of the shock that we introduce. So recall that our shock is disaggregated by region, sector, and labor type. To produce this chart, I've aggregated over sectors and labor types to get an average regional shock. And what we see here is that the tropics are most affected. So countries in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and also West Africa see the largest labor capacity declines. This is a sectoral view of the same labor capacity shock. So this is all 65 sectors that we have in our database. Each box is a sector, and the size of the box is proportionate to the labor capacity loss in that sector. So we see that the largest labor capacity losses are for example, rice paddy, fiber crops, oilseeds. All of agriculture really has some of the largest labor capacity losses. Outside of agriculture, some manufacturing sectors, so this is rice processing, and then the orange boxes are mining, construction here, are all some of the sectors that see the larger labor capacity losses. Here we're looking at impacts on GDP. So on top, this is the same graph as before. This is the labor capacity loss by region. And down below, we see the resulting GDP losses. And we do see that there's a divergence in patterns somewhat. So for example, West Africa sees much sharper GDP declines relative to its labor capacity losses. And this is explained by the West Africa's dependence on agriculture, as well as dependence on unskilled labor or blue-collar type labor. Here we're looking at output and prices of just two sectors. We're focusing on agriculture and construction, which we saw are one of the more affected sectors. So the maps on top are output. The top left is output of agriculture. So we see that the largest output declines of agriculture occur in West Africa. On the right, on top, we have output, how output of construction is affected. And here, again, West Africa is affected, but also South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Central America there. So we're seeing output declines on top, and this leads to, in general, higher prices down below is what we see in these charts here. Here we're turning to how employment is affected, and this is where those equations that I just showed become relevant. So we're focusing here on Asia and Africa because those are the more affected regions. So the orange series here is construction. So for example, construction in Indonesia sees its employment increase by 6%, employment of labor. And the blue dots are agriculture. So for example, agriculture in Nigeria sees its employment increase by a little over 2%. And both these examples are part of a broader pattern. Both construction and agriculture in most cases see employment of labor increase. So again, referring back to those equations, what this means is that the dominant effect here is the direct effect of the productivity shock. So as labor becomes less productive, these sectors are pulling in more labor in order as a way to So they're pulling in more labor because as each unit of labor becomes less productive, you need more labor in order to produce the same level of output. That's the dominant effect in these cases. But the other example, for example, here is manufacturing and mining in Nigeria, which sees its employment fall by close to 4%. What this means is that the dominant effect here is either a substitution for capital, or the sector as a whole just shrinks. There's a contraction effect. That's the more dominant effect here. Turning quickly to aspects of trade, here we're looking at how terms of trade are affected globally. We see some beneficiary countries. So this is Ethiopia, and I believe Tanzania down below. Some countries in West Africa do end up benefiting, at least in terms of their terms of trade. Venezuela and the Middle East, for example, lose out in terms of their terms of trade. Finally, turning to some poverty results. So here we're looking at these are factor returns, and they're adjusted for the real cost of living. These are results from the poverty module at this point. So the blue dots are how returns to agricultural unskilled labor changes. So notice that returns to this factor are increasing, which means that households that derive a larger share of their income from this factor will be beneficiaries. And the reason why the returns or wages to agricultural unskilled labor is going up is because as heat stress lowers productivity, it is effectively creating a sort of shortage of this type of labor. So their returns go up. The returns to other factors as a result fall because those higher wages for agricultural unskilled labor are diluting their returns. So if you're a household that earns most of your income from agricultural unskilled labor, you're going to be a beneficiary. If you are more dependent on other factors for your income, you end up losing out. So let's focus in on Indonesia here as we look at poverty results in just a second. So in Indonesia, we see that all the other factors lose out. Unskilled agricultural labor sees its real returns increase. So these are the final results for the poverty head count. So Indonesia is on top. And here we see that within the agricultural stratum, poverty actually declines. So again, this is explained by this here, the fact that returns to agricultural unskilled labor are increasing. And from here we can guess, I didn't put in the actual numbers here, but Indonesia does have a large share of its income for the agricultural stratum coming from agricultural unskilled labor. So that explains that large green there. However, for all the other stratums, there's an increase in poverty because these are strata that are dependent on other factors, and returns to those factors are declining. So the net effect is still negative for Indonesia. So some of the other countries that see the larger impacts on poverty are Uganda, Bangladesh, Venezuela, Philippines. And this is out of this subset of 27 countries that we actually do have in the POV module. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Wajiha, for the very interesting and important study. So we are ready to take questions from audience. If you have any questions, feel free to provide them and enter your questions or comments in the chat board.
Maybe I can ask just directly?
Sure, of course.
Yeah, great talk. Yeah, great talk. Very interesting. A very detailed comment. What about agricultural workers thinking about West Africa that work in agroforestry systems, in coffee or cocoa, for instance, where you have shading? I know this is very detailed, but do you think that that could make a difference? Because I just learned recently agroforestry makes up quite a high share of total land use. In Europe, it's 20%, by the way. But yeah, so
well, that's an interesting comment. Yeah. So no, we treat forestry the same as all other agriculture. So we're not accounting for it being especially more shaded than just any other type of agriculture. But that's an interesting point.
Yeah, I also treated it the same. So, but you know, when you do forestry work in winter and you have a broadleaf forest, then there's sun coming through. That's my excuse.
Right.
Okay. Thanks.
So we have another question from Gabriel. So Gabriel, would you like to elaborate your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the nice presentation. In this version of the GTAP model, is labor still perfectly mobile across sectors? Because maybe if not, sluggish labor across sectors could be an interesting test to see how the results could change, but I don't know.
The assumptions are standard, but why would you want to make labor sluggish?
No, because I was thinking as a form of adaptation, maybe to following the productivity signal, the price, the signal price given by the productivity shock. Maybe labor can relocate in other sectors, and this could maybe decrease the negative effects. But I'm just wondering. It's more a sensitivity test, let's say, to see how this assumption can be relevant.
Right. I'm wondering now what the standard assumption is about labor. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe labor is allowed to move across sectors. It's not stuck there.
Can I jump in on that?
Sure.
So the specification we're using now of the labor market has this segmentation between ag and non-ag. So maybe somewhat reminiscent of Arndt's specification. So households are looking at, should I work in ag or should I work in non-ag? So this idea of potentially disutility coming in could affect the labor supply to ag, although we haven't built that in yet either. But there is that segmentation between ag and non-ag to capture that big difference between those two types. But within ag and within non-ag, there's full mobility. Do you want to add any more to that, Wajiha? I know, yeah, you just jumped with this particular model, and Gabrielle is kind of asking from a more general context, but there are many, I think most people at this conference might be assuming perfect mobility across all sectors. So in that sense, what we've assumed is more restrictive. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So we have another question from Taoyuan. So Taoyuan, would you like to elaborate your question?
Yeah, I can try. Yeah. I just very simple question. I just wonder in your model related to the previous question, do you allow labor flows mobile across regions, not only not limited in one region? You can allow migration. One labor move to another region from Europe to Asia, for example. And also, I also wonder if the heat stress will also affect crop production and capital assets. Which one is more important, do you think? And yeah, sorry, I have one more. do you use a static model, right?
It is a static model, and in this particular paper, we're shocking just labor alone. So we're assuming, so we have not changed how yields are affected or how capital assets are affected. The question of which one is more important is actually answered by, I think, the Lima et al. Paper, at least with reference to agriculture. So what they found is that in agriculture, at least, the loss of labor productivity can have GDP impacts, for example, that are as bad as the yield effects in tropical countries, at least. And Dr. Hurtle might add more to that. And about labor flows between countries, I'm actually not entirely sure about that either. I believe, so our market clearing for labor is at the regional level, which would mean that no, we do not allow for flow between countries.
Yeah, you allow unemployment, right?
Only, sorry, what?
Yeah, within one region, you allow people don't have work. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Taoyuan,
yeah, thank you.
I can jump in as well. Yeah, I mean, your question about migration is really important. Obviously, there are a lot of limits to migration. A lot of countries attempting to, even shut down their borders for migration, but it's happening nonetheless. So the question is, as the pressure builds, will those policies remain in place? What will happen? I mean, it is an interesting question. I don't think the amount of migration presently international migration is enough to make a difference in these numbers. But at some point, it seems like the dam may break in one way or the other. I don't know. So that's an interesting point. Of course, the heat stress on labor will affect output and the valuation of capital assets through the derived demands and equilibrium outcomes. Yeah, we are only shocking that, as Wajih has showed you, that biased technical change on labor. So it's really a targeted strike there.
Yes, that's good. Yeah, because we only provide a partial story. We only labor, capital, or the production yield. What is the aggregate one? Perhaps that's also an interesting question. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We have another question from Liuk. So, Liuk, would you like to elaborate your question?
Yeah, sure, I'll try. It's a bit of a thought experiment. I haven't really thought it through. But I was just thinking whether you could make some adjustment in work hours, sort of imposing a siesta in the warmest hours, whether it would be possible to estimate a potential benefit from that, if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I can go first, I guess. It is possible to do that, I believe. So when we estimate our labor capacity losses, what we've done is made a more sort of simplified assumption. We assume that people work during daytime hours only. So it's kind of like assuming that people will work in the best possible daytime hours that are available to them. But it is possible to assume that people could work nighttime as well. So we actually do have those labor capacity losses, but those are not the ones that we used in this analysis. So we could assume that nighttime hours are available as well.
Thank you, Wajiha. So we still have some time. If you have any other questions, please feel free to ask.
May I add a comment?
Yes, go ahead.
So regarding changing the working hours during the day or night, so the point is that the heat stress is mainly on hot days of summer. So in other part of the year, the impact, as Arnold shows, that there are heat stress, but it's smaller. And then in the summertime, you have very long days, and most importantly, you have humidity, and humidity is more important than temperature at that time. So even night is humid in the tropical regions. When that means it's a good thought experiment. I think it's worth doing that for some regions to see how it works. But my understanding from the metrics is that for tropical region, when humidity is high, probably you don't get a lot from shifting working hours, and regardless of all the costs of implementing that policy.
Maybe I can add very quickly. There's this paper by Takakura and then colleagues from 2018, which have precisely looked into shifts in working time. I can maybe share the link to that paper. I actually don't know the results by heart.
So any questions or comments?
So there's a lot of adjustment that's already occurred in the tropics. So the siesta is implemented in many places, and that's for good reason. So that's it's a good point. And I think we need to bear in mind that what we are observing is already a situation of significant heat stress during certain parts of the day in the tropics. So, yeah.
So I can provide a minor comment or a statement in page 1 of the study. So in page 1 of the study, there is a sentence saying that returns to land and capital are decreased when labor productivity is decreased. I think the question here is that if at the same time more labor is hired, land and labor productivity may indeed also increase, or at least having some positive impact on land and capital productivity. So I think the question is really the comparison between the decrease in labor productivity and the increase in the amount of labor being hired. So any other comments or feedback on this?
I didn't hear part of your question very well. Could you repeat what you said right in the beginning? You cited a passage from a paper or something?
So in page 1 of the study, it states that return to land and capital are decreased when labor productivity is decreased. But I think this is only conditional on the fact that the amount of labor being hired remains the same. So the question is that even with a decreased labor productivity, if the employment is indeed increased, then eventually land and capital return may actually increase. So it really depends on a more accurate statement, in my opinion, would be the comparison between the decrease in labor productivity and the increase in employment. So
okay.
Just wonder, am I misunderstanding something, or maybe you can provide a better insight regarding this?
Well, our thinking, I think, in writing that is that, so as labor productivity falls, it's effectively creating a sort of a shortage of labor, and you need to offer higher wages to attract labor to a sector like agriculture that is affected by heat stress. So in order to pull in more labor from other sectors, you need to offer those higher wages, which means returns to capital, or essentially your profits from agriculture decline is the thought there.
Thanks for the feedback, Wajiha. So we can take the last questions if there is any. So feel free to raise your questions now.
Yeah, can I just ask a stupid question, perhaps? Do you think it's possible or necessary to develop a dynamic model with so many regions and sectors? It's possible, or
I think it's possible. I don't know, Iman, do you have experience? I don't have that much experience with dynamic modeling, but I believe that it requires a lot of time to establish a baseline period or a trajectory, which complicates things. And then I guess the question is, what do we gain by going dynamic that we don't see from the static analysis?
yeah, it can provide more detailed information over the past.
Right. But yes, well, that's true. Mm-hmm.
So I can provide a comment regarding this. So
Yes.
I work a lot in the recursive dynamic model. What I'm thinking about is that a static model is also fine to me to study issues like this. But a way to make the representation even more accurate is that within a static framework, you may consider using the so-called forward calibration, such that, for example, if your base year is 2011, and now you would like to study some kind of policy impact in 2015, then the first step you may do is to calibrate the model to a state to represent 2050 by increasing, for example, labor endowment or capital endowment through some kind of projection elsewhere. And also to include some impact on either labor productivity or other kind of productivity. And to consider the possible revolution of, for example, energy efficiency improvement. So even with a static framework, you still can do a lot of, you can still gain a lot of insight from the simulation.
Yeah, I agree. We can do a lot with these things. Yeah, but in my opinion, it's difficult to calibrate the model or just to follow the economic structure in 2050, for example. You don't know if the agriculture still dominate one developing economy or not. That's very hard.
Well, it will be, yes, I agree. And we are not going to specify the industrial structure using the forward calibration. So all what is going to do, what will be taken care of by forward calibration is that it is like you impose a kind of shock on labor and capital by increasing the endowment and let the model solve and find the solution. So it is not as comprehensive as dynamic model, per se dynamic or in forward-looking framework, but at least it is one step to let the model provide a better insight for future emission level, energy use level, etc. In my opinion, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it captures some aspect, but not the main advantage of Cge model. I think Cge model, the main advantage is the industrial structure. For others, we can use other models. In fact, you have this dynamic forecast. It's not necessary to use Cge model. I don't know if yeah, this right or wrong.
So, any other comments?
I want to have one quick comment on the dynamics. So it really depends on the question and the objective of your research. Technically, yes, you can, but in terms of the objective, what you want to answer. So we are working on a dynamic version of simple G. It is simple, it's simplified, it's not considering all the details of GTAP sectors. So the whole idea there is to just look at the variation of prices and variation and then food security impact. For that, we just focus on agriculture. But if you have other things in mind, then welcome to the club. It's possible, but you need to invest a lot on model calibration, decide about time intervals, parameterization, short term versus long run, and a lot of adjustments you need to do.
Yes, I agree. I'm thinking, in fact, we can try to develop an economic model, something like the big climate model. We let it run for 1 year, for example, or 6 months, and get a result.
That's $1 billion question.
Okay, thanks everyone's time. This will wrap up our final presentation and discussion period for this session. So please help me in thanking our presenters, Ant, Taoyuan, Iman, and Wajiha for offering such a wonderful and thought-provoking studies.